is great for them. I don't, I would say that on larger lakes, if you're trying to get lake-wide nutrient control with floating wetlands, you really have to be careful.
But I don't think we don't have a problem in the middle of the lake, right?
Well, I mean,
It's only on the shallower.
I mean, I would second that 100%, everything that AJ said. I think when I first heard the idea, I was really intrigued. It's a rather new technology, kind of emerging in the last 10 or so years. And there are like wonder stories of where it's worked and done things fantastically. But again, it's a very site-specific strategy. And then it becomes how big does it need to be in order to affect this area. But I think the question is also sometimes, well, I'm not an expert on floating wetlands. I've read some stuff about it. I'm familiar with them. To me, there might be more cost-effective solutions. And I think a lot of times it has to do with the underwater topography of the lake, right? So floating wetlands can often be used in areas where you don't have a shallow shoreline. I don't know, I mean, you said something about, so one idea I was thinking about was just planting the coves or planting particular, I think you have to identify where the pollutants are coming in first, right? And understanding those points that the external influences are affecting the lake. Yeah. And prioritize things potentially at those locations. And whether that would be your floating wetlands in those locations or planting buffers in the shallow cove areas. But you had mentioned a lot of the plants that grow in the actual soil are getting most of their nutrients from the soil. They're not extracting it from the water. Yeah.
And the other thing to understand about these coves is nutrients are one of the three major pieces for algae growth, which is going to be the nuisance. And coves are just naturally shallower, they're more quiescent, they don't move as much. So even with or without a floating wetland, you still have good conditions, regardless of the nutrient load in those coves to grow more algae than you would out in the main lakes. I mean, we see that in all. And also, toxins, if you have a cyanobacteria bloom, they're blown into a cove, they get concentrated at the shoreline areas. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's not a referendum on floating islands, it's just if you engage in a technique like that, really do work as far as what's your goals, and I guess that's where it comes to, how much, what's your phosphorus level, what's your nitrogen level, how much do you think these floating wetlands will reduce those loads, and then when you do it, monitor that to make sure you're reaching that goal. Because the last thing you want to do is put a whole bunch of these floating wetlands out there, and then find out 5 or 6 years later they're doing nothing, or worse, and hopefully it doesn't happen, they're actually having a negative impact.
We would just pilot one maybe.
We pilot, anytime, pilots would be always great because then it's controlled, you can see. Now, obviously, site-specific ones, you have to take it with a little grain of salt and you extrapolate any of that out to anywhere, and I think it goes the same way with plantings, pilot plantings and stuff. But I guess the goal is know what the problem is, know how much you want to reduce the nutrients by, implement it, but then track it throughout time.
Are they reversible if you put them in the bed, or they're even worse, we can take them out?
Yeah, you can pull them out, yeah.
So,
I don't know the cost of pulling them out and the cost of implementation.
Yeah.
Anytime you put a big structure in a lake, that's another regulatory hurdle, so that's another thing to keep in mind. I don't know, you have anything to add to that?
Personally, I don't know. I think we have to get the information first. My gut feeling tells me it's not like the day one strategy. It's not the panacea that's going to really fix everything.
I have something that's just sort of a philosophical or sociologic thing, which is that people really want to do something. And so a project is extraordinarily attractive to people. If we could do this, if we could do that. And that's great, and if it's the right project and it's thought through carefully, it may be the right thing to do. But sometimes it also gets tempered by, well, this is limited and it's affordable and we could get a lot of volunteers to work on it. And sometimes those are not the right reasons to do that project. And sometimes there's a lot of patience involved, and the patience is really difficult. So it's a little bit of a downer, because everybody wants to do something.
Our lake the shoreline is mostly hard armor.
stone or cement, or something, hard. We have very little natural shoreline.
Right.
Would you recommend people remove or somehow, make chinks in the armor to plant things, in there,
Well, I think it's always a good idea to try and restore the natural shoreline to a point where, as best as you can. Obviously, people have docks and they want beaches and, there's different, personal and societal things you have to kind of, whatever your property is, but, I mean, natural shorelines, it's been proven through years and years and years of research that they're effective at, they do a lot of the same things that riprap does, as I mentioned before, but they can self-regenerate and they provide habitat and, all the other things to keep going on. So yeah, I would always, anyone that's looking to do that would, now there are things to consider, it's not like every technique, there are negatives. Some plants, and I speak for the aquatic ones more than anything, some of them can, even if they're native, can become a nuisance. So understanding, where your plots is, what particular plants you're planting in those areas, it's all things you kind of need to consider, because the last thing you want to do is go in and plant a bunch of plants and, you're very happy about it, and then it spreads to 5 other neighbors' shorelines, And, it could be a concern, so I know it kind of goes back to the whole think about it and plan it out, but yeah, so as far as your question about natural shoreline, yes.
I think there's a couple of different possibilities within that. I think is like, can you break down the bulkhead in certain areas and allow the water to come in and create this kind of somewhat ephemeral garden, right? That gets inundated when the water gets higher and then drains out when it gets lower, right? I think also one of the images that you showed that I asked the bulkhead question about just had a lot of shrubby vegetation hanging over the edge, or a tree right at the edge that provides the 10 feet of shaded kind of habitat at the water edge that provides fish habitat and other things that can also be effective solution.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also you could look at upland of your bulkhead. Can you create a catchment area, that collects your personal stormwater and then plant the appropriate plants there, So I think it could be like a kind of multi-pronged strategy depending on your topography, your lot, and how there's going to be multi-strategies that work on a property by property basis.
Yeah, and some soils that are right, like in like lake sediments, they may actually not be conducive to, let's say, cattails. Maybe it's very, very hard or gravelly, so maybe that's just something you just can't do at that point. Short of some crazy excavation project, which would probably be more of a headache than, it would be worth. So, maybe that's where, if you're thinking about a holistic, let's say, stormwater management for your whole property, maybe that's where you focus more on the upland sites where you can get more, a little bit more bang for your buck there,
I would totally second that. It gets to be a question of, when you remove something, what does it then allow to happen in the future? And so I was explaining to Ina, like, I've got miscanthus grass, right, that was planted in the late 80s or early 90s, which is now on the New York State invasive plant list, recently designated. It gets to be like 8 feet tall, and its root structure is mirrored underground, right?
Yeah.
So it's got this rhizomatic root structure. It's going to capture all this stuff. It is definitely doing a lot to in terms of stormwater management, both subsurface and surface. And so the cost to actually rip that out is, backhoe, and it's very invasive, it's very extensive, and maybe you could put panicum as a native grass in its place.
Yeah.
It's going to get 4 to 5 feet tall. It's going to do a similar thing, have a similar kind of root structure, but at what cost and what kind of value?
That's why I think it was really important that David showed you the variety of plants you can plant, because everyone is going to have a little, some are going to be similar in the root structure, but they're going to have different root structures and different benefits, and so it's not just one thing here. You can really say, listen, I have a completely challenging situation here, but there's probably, it's fair to say there's probably a plant or two you could still work with, even in super challenging, conditions.
And I know other people probably have miscanthus maybe originally from my house that it's been spread around the way, because you can take a piece of it and it grows and it's so surviving. But what you can do, in terms of starts to shoot up with the plumes in early September, you kind of whack back the top of it, and you don't allow those to go to seed and spread out over everything. So from some simple kind of effective landscape management strategies, you can work with some of those existing conditions that might not be the most cost-effective thing to do day one.
I know, to get real specific on one beach closing, at Spur Beach, you said that the beach is closed because of one particular spot that generates the harmful blooms. Would it be possible, from what AJ said about light, to just tarp that area, block the light out, and maybe stop some of the bloom that way?
So would you be talking about like there's like a groundwater
What
sieve,
the-
you think?
Yeah, it works for land plants, you put tarps under the water, but I don't know that you could put it on the surface.
So if you meant like a dye that was blocking the light, as I mentioned before, you're meaning like a physical.
I'm wondering what the, if there is an answer that way. If it's a specific area of the specific part of the lake that's giving us a specific beach closing on a consistent basis, and we know that it originates right there, is there something that we could do just short term? I mean, heck, I'll go down with blue tarp, go around and stake it to the land, and if it can't get any light there,
Do we
if
know
that's
it
the area.
originates there, or
No,
does it just
it-
end up
that's where-
there?
So
Yeah.
if you think about it, we basically have a prevalent wind that's southeast. So it comes from the south towards the north and from the east towards the west. And some people happen to be on the northwest corner of this lake and everything goes there. But anybody on the west
Yeah.
side, anybody on the north side is going to collect more, any kind
Yeah.
of place where you have there. So I don't know that it's always originating there. I don't know that it's not possible that by thinking about overhanging shade branches, by thinking maybe about planting in what I call the armpit
Yeah.
at Spur
Yeah.
Beach.
Yeah.
So what I would say is
Yeah,
this, there's
perfect.
a couple, at least with algae, so plants are a little different. You know, there's techniques you can put barriers over plants, they call it benthic barriers. You have to, you can either do it yourself or on bigger scale projects, divers come in and they actually put a tarp down that's semi-porous, because if it's not porous at all, gas builds up under it and pop it up to the surface. And it'll actually shade the complete light out. Remember, these are plants though. Algae is a little different, for a couple reasons. One, as I was mentioning, the source is, even though that can be one source, it's probably not the whole source of where it's coming from. It may be more cost effective to deal with the source versus getting a short term. And a very specific example is if you have a pond, let's say, and that's happening, you have to pay an applicator to come out and put that pond dye out. So you have to pay for the cost of that pond dye and the cost of the applicator driving out and doing it, right? And then they're gonna probably put you on a plan where let's say if it rains, that pond dye gets swept out in 2 weeks and the algae starts growing. You gotta put it down more and more and more. And it may be more cost effective just to deal with that source, whatever it is. Now, it may not be, depending on what the severity of the source. The other thing is that algae have strategies to be able to get around that. Cyanobacteria actually have these gas vesicles where they can move up and down in the water column, which is a really weird thing for a plant to move. But it's one of the things they can do to kind of regulate, and they can get light all the way up to the surface. And if you were to shade it, it may stop that particular area, but like we were talking about with coves, there's nothing stopping wind blowing that cyanobacteria into a particular spot. So one thing to understand is that if you see cyanobacteria in a cove, it doesn't always mean that it grew in that cove and it grew to the abundance in that particular cove. It was probably distributed throughout the lake at some level and came in. Because water is constantly, moving in all directions. And one thing I probably should have said in the beginning of the talk, and this is just kind of a lake management truism, is the surface of the lake for us is particularly uninteresting in terms of the functioning of the lake. Now the symptoms, yes, you have your plants on the surface of the lake and your algae scums and the shoreline erosion, but in terms of the functioning of how the lake works, it's more about what's happening on the bottom and what's happening in the immediate watershed as far as what's driving those mechanisms. So I'm always wary of, if a stakeholder says, oh, we have this particular area of problem and this, with the surface scum, it could be a lot of different things. So what I would say is, it's possible, but there'd probably be better use of the funds to be able to control it on a lake-wide scale.
And one of the ironies is we talk here about nutrient contaminants, and we're used to thinking of nutrients as thing is a problem. Nutrient contaminants means that even that phosphorus and nitrogen, which is in all of our bodies, is critical for all of life on Earth, is when there's too much, that becomes a nutrient contaminant. And it's kind of hard for people to sometimes get their heads around the fact that we're calling a nutrient a contaminant.
Yeah.
But that's what we're doing. And I think, to me, it's like, always looking at the nutrients and where their source is, because everything else ends up being a little bit of Band-Aids rather than.
And to add on to that, you know, it's always, you know, short-term and long-term should be used in conjunction. You know, I think the other end of the spectrum is dangerous too, where you say, well, you know, we have all these we have all these problems, but we have all the sources, so let's not do anything in the lake because we have to address these sources, because then you start to lose buy-in from the public. You know, if you just let the lake, if you're trying to sell the lake on a plan, well, let's just do things in the watershed, because watershed and these plantings, they take a long time for the actual for the actual results to manifest in the lakes over time. So there has to be a little bit of a balance. It's just, at least in my opinion, it'd rather be more, the split would be better like 30-70, let's say, you know, 70% in the watershed, but just enough to make sure the beaches are open, you know, do things to make sure that recreation is, you know, it's not impacted enough. So that's what I would say.
The danger of too much short-term is that it makes people complacent.
Yeah.
And it doesn't solve the problem. But yes, I think, you know, you have property values to look at, so short-term and long-term is useful.
I think identifying some short-term projects is really important. Like you said, you know, whether it's the floating wetlands or whether it's improvements at Spur Beach, like galvanizing the community into like an action plan where people can come out and volunteer and feel like they have a stake in it, I think is really important as we're looking at some of these longer term strategies that are 3, 5, 10-year plans.
Yeah. Another good thing would be to rope in real estate agents around the area and kind of talk to them about what they see in different areas as far as the impact of property values when you have a system that's really impaired versus a system that recovers, and kind of bring them in on this. Because oftentimes they have a very unique sense of what's going on in terms of the way the economics are fluctuating. And, you know, a lot of this comes down to money, you know. So if you sell to the town and you wanted to do a huge retrofit, or to the state or the county, you know, having some economic behind that, I think would be.
Okay, I'm a realtor.
Yeah. So am I talking out of my, you know what? Or?
No.
Okay.
I've sold 35 houses in Roaringburg Lake, so I know from whence I
Great, yeah.
speak. But I also have very good friends over on Tibbet Lake.
Yep.
Okay? Tibbet Lake, there are realtors who will not even show Tibbet Lake because of the quality of that
Yeah,
lake.
that's one of our clients. Yeah.
Which has now, as I understand it from my friends on Tibbet, lost their designation as a lake. They are now a wetlands,
Yeah.
which really prohibits what they can do with what used to be their lake.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what we're going through right now. Yeah, that lake is really that's in a different that's really shallow.
It's only 3.5 feet deep.
Yeah. It's they have some definite regulatory issues they're gonna have to get through, I think. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, one thing that